There are moments when what someone feels stops behaving like an emotion and starts behaving like something they can no longer fully control. Not because of what you did, but because of what you activated inside them. Something that doesn't fade just because they try to walk away from it. Someone can appear to be deeply, almost overwhelmingly in love with you. And the strange part is that the real reason behind it may feel less like a compliment and more like something unsettling. Because it often has very little to do with who you think you are, and much more to do with what you accidentally stirred inside them. And once you see it clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee. We are usually taught to believe love is based on attraction, shared values, timing, or compatibility. That idea is reassuring, but reassurance doesn't always equal truth. The mind tends to choose what feels safe over what feels real. But intense, irrational forms of love don't usually come from logic at all. They rise from deeper layers of the psyche, from places people don't normally access consciously. Without realizing it, you may have touched something in them that was long kept buried. Not because you tried to, and not because of anything deliberate, but simply because your presence bypassed the usual defenses they rely on. You didn't just make them feel good or noticed. You made them feel seen in a way that felt too exposing, even threatening, and that's where attachment becomes stronger than expected. When someone feels emotionally recognized at that depth, admiration can shift into something far more consuming. It stops being a simple connection and starts becoming fixation. Most people misunderstand this and assume love is just being liked more intensely. But what's happening underneath is far more complex. You triggered something like recognition, but not of your surface traits. It was recognition of something inside them they had not fully faced. A part of them that was quiet, hidden, or suppressed suddenly had a mirror. And unconsciously, you became that mirror. Not through effort or intention, but simply through the way you exist in their awareness. Their internal defenses, the ones designed to keep certain emotions controlled or out of sight, start to weaken around that kind of experience. And when those defenses weaken, emotions don't come out in a clean or organized way. They come mixed, distorted, and intense. Longing blends with fear. Curiosity blends with discomfort. Attachment begins to blur into obsession without a clear boundary. What makes this even more complicated is that this reaction is not fully conscious. A part of them is responding in ways they can't easily explain, because the real process is happening beneath awareness. That's why their behavior can feel inconsistent. They may feel strongly drawn to you at one moment, then suddenly distant the next. It's not that the feeling disappears, it's that internal resistance takes over. The mind often treats emotional exposure as a kind of threat, not because of danger itself, but because of vulnerability. So it creates distance to regain control. This creates a cycle of closeness and withdrawal, intensity and confusion. And even if you don't fully name it, you can likely sense that emotional weight in the connection. At some point, projection begins to take over. You are no longer experienced only as a person, but as something symbolic. An answer to something they could not clearly articulate in themselves. A presence that feels meaningful beyond explanation. And when that happens, letting go doesn't just feel like losing you. It feels like facing what you activated in them. That is what makes release so difficult. The attachment is no longer only about you. It is tied to inner material they are not ready to confront. So even confusion, even discomfort, can still keep them emotionally hooked. But there is another layer to this that is often overlooked. What gets awakened in these situations is not always calm or stable. When suppressed emotions surface, they don't emerge gently. They surge upward, distorting perception and intensifying emotional responses. Everything can start to feel bigger, more charged, more significant than it objectively is. That's why the connection can feel so charged even in silence. A look, a pause, a small interaction can carry disproportionate emotional weight. Yet neither person fully understands why. Because it isn't unfolding at the surface level where logic operates, but in deeper psychological layers where contradiction can exist without resolution. This is also why the push and pull dynamic appears. Moments of closeness are followed by withdrawal, not because the connection is gone, but because internal defenses reactivate. Something inside signals that the emotional exposure is too much, even if it is also desired. And so the cycle continues. Intensity, retreat, return, confusion. A rhythm neither side fully controls. Even you may feel it, the emotional heaviness, the pull, the sense that something unspoken is always present beneath the surface. The deeper truth is that nothing about this is purely accidental. There was a moment of recognition, subtle but irreversible. And once that inner recognition happens, the system does not return to how it was before. But that recognition was never about your external traits. It was about what you symbolically represent in their unconscious mind, something both longed for and avoided at the same time. Something familiar in feeling, but difficult to face directly. In that sense, you didn't simply become someone they are attached to. You became a trigger for material that had been dormant for years. And once that kind of inner material is activated, it doesn't simply fade away. It continues to unfold, slowly demanding awareness until it can no longer be ignored. It doesn't show itself in obvious ways. It works quietly, beneath the surface, in a way most people completely misunderstand. Obsession is usually imagined as loud or desperate, but in reality it often looks calm on the outside, controlled, contained, even distant. Because when emotions become too intense, the conscious mind doesn't express them freely. It tries to suppress them. And suppression doesn't reduce the feeling, it deepens it. So instead of open expression, what happens is internal fixation. They start replaying moments with you, overanalyzing conversations, searching for meanings in small details that normally wouldn't matter. Not because they decide to, but because their mind keeps returning without permission. Something about you becomes tied to an unresolved emotional thread inside them, and anything unfinished psychologically tends to gain power over time. But the intensity is not actually only about you as a person. It's also about what you represent. In deeper psychological terms, people rarely attach only to individuals. They attach to meaning, to emotional symbolism, to internal projections. And in that process, you begin to represent something far bigger than your surface identity. For them, you can start to embody something they feel they lost, something they never received, or something they were conditioned to believe was not meant for them. And that is where the emotional weight increases. Because connection with you is no longer neutral, it becomes a confrontation with themselves. One part of them is drawn closer, another part resists just as strongly. Not because the feeling is fake, but because the feeling creates exposure. And exposure forces them to face inner material they've spent years avoiding. That internal split begins to show itself indirectly, through inconsistency, mixed signals, moments of closeness followed by sudden withdrawal. You can sense it, the shift in tone, the unpredictability, the way presence and distance seem to alternate without clear explanation. But the real conflict is not between you and them, it is inside them. You are simply what activated it. A part of the mind that operates below logic has been awakened, one built from memory, emotion, and suppressed desire. And when that layer becomes active, it starts generating questions they cannot easily answer. Why it feels so familiar, why it feels so intense, why it feels right and overwhelming at the same time. At that point, the mind tries to restore balance. Distance becomes a coping strategy. Space is created in the hope that the intensity will fade, that time will weaken the pull. But psychologically, what is not resolved does not dissolve through avoidance. It often intensifies because absence replaces clarity with imagination. And imagination is where attachment grows strongest. You are no longer experienced purely as a person in real interaction. You become an internal image, a constructed meaning, a projection that continues to evolve inside their mind. And projections are not limited by reality, so they expand, deepen, and become emotionally amplified over time. This is why detachment becomes increasingly difficult. Because the attachment is no longer only to who you are in reality, but to what you represent internally. And what you represent cannot easily be replaced, because it is tied to something emotionally significant and unfinished. At the same time, there is mistrust in the intensity itself. It feels too strong, too fast, too consuming. So doubt enters, fear enters, not necessarily to erase the connection, but to protect the mind from what full acceptance might demand. Because accepting it completely would also mean facing everything it has been avoiding for years. So they remain in an in-between state, pulled forward and pulled back at the same time, thinking constantly but acting cautiously, feeling deeply but expressing very little. And over time, that internal tension doesn't disappear. It accumulates. Eventually, something has to give. The mind is not built to hold unresolved emotional conflict indefinitely. And when it reaches its limit, the release does not always look controlled or predictable. It can come out as emotional confession, sudden withdrawal, or even behavior that appears irrational or self-defeating. Because once deeper psychological layers take over, logic stops leading the response. Emotion does. And that is the point where the experience shifts from internal struggle into visible change. The important truth is that this does not fade easily. What was activated does not simply return to silence. It continues to press for resolution. And resolution always demands some form of emotional cost. The only real uncertainty is what they will be forced to confront or let go of when they can no longer keep the tension contained. And that pressure is already building quietly in the background, even when nothing is being said. That heavy, almost suffocating emotional weight doesn't simply disappear. It lingers, because what is happening inside them is no longer steady or contained. It builds pressure within the psyche, and that kind of pressure always looks for an outlet. But release is not always clarity. Sometimes it is collapse. And this is where it becomes difficult for them, because what they are experiencing is no longer simple attraction or curiosity. It has turned into confrontation. A confrontation with parts of themselves they have kept buried for years. Old wounds, rejection, insecurity, and deeply held beliefs about not being enough, or being too much, or being unworthy of genuine emotional connection. Then you enter their experience, and without forcing anything or even intending it, you disturb the structure holding those beliefs in place. The mind does not tolerate contradiction easily. It resists it. It reorganizes perception to preserve internal stability. Because if they were to fully accept what you represent, they would also have to reconsider how they see themselves. And that is not a gentle adjustment. It is an internal reconstruction. So instead of integrating what they feel, they divide around it. One part moves toward you, drawn in by connection, emotional intensity, and the rare sense of being seen in a way they have not felt before. But another part pulls away with equal force, reacting to something they cannot clearly explain, labeling it as unsafe, overwhelming, or too exposing. And that is where the weight increases. Because the closer they feel to you, the more exposed they feel within themselves. And that kind of exposure doesn't register as simple vulnerability. Internally, it feels like instability, like a threat to identity itself. You are no longer just a person they are drawn to. You become a disruption to their internal structure, something that challenges the identity they built for emotional survival. And structures built for survival do not change easily. They resist. They defend. Sometimes quietly, sometimes abruptly. So the mind begins creating explanations, narratives that reduce intensity. Maybe it is temporary. Maybe it is imagination. Maybe they are reading too much into it. But underneath those explanations is not real understanding. It is containment. Because to truly understand it would mean acknowledging its depth. And acknowledging its depth would mean acknowledging its reality. Yet the deeper emotional system does not respond to rational framing. The pull remains steady, persistent, and uninvited. And over time, what is unprocessed does not fade. It transforms into restlessness, into anxiety, into a subtle sense of lack that appears even when everything looks normal on the surface. And gradually, you become associated with that internal state, not because of anything you chose, but because their mind has linked you to something unresolved, something emotionally significant that cannot be easily replaced or redirected. This is where instability begins to show in small fragments. Moments where control slips, where they almost express what they feel, almost reveal the depth of it, almost let clarity surface. But then the resistance returns even stronger, because now they are not only reacting to you, they are reacting to their own emotional intensity. A cycle forms. The closer they move, the more they panic. The more they pull away, the stronger the internal pull becomes. Over time, this repetition begins to wear them down. Outwardly, they may still appear composed, controlled, even detached. But internally there is fragmentation because a psychological conflict has formed that cannot be easily resolved. They want closeness, but closeness requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is exactly what their defenses were designed to avoid. So they remain suspended between opposing forces, desire and fear, recognition and denial, approach and withdrawal. And what most people misunderstand is that this is not just emotional tension. It becomes identity-level tension. Because moving toward you would require them to become someone more emotionally open, more exposed, more honest with themselves. And that version of them feels unfamiliar, even unsafe. But moving away does not resolve anything, it only relocates the feeling. Because what has been activated does not stay behind, it follows. It reappears as longing, as doubt, as the quiet question of what is being lost in the process. And that question slowly erodes certainty from within. At that point, there is no neutral position left, only two forms of discomfort, facing what is felt or continuing to suppress it. But suppression is never clean, because what you have become in their internal world is no longer just a passing thought or memory. It has taken symbolic form, something the unconscious keeps returning to, and the unconscious does not forget in the way the conscious mind does. It replays, it reconstructs, it resurfaces in unexpected thoughts, in dreams, in quiet moments where distraction no longer fills the space. Pressure builds again, because the mind cannot hold contradiction indefinitely. At some point, something has to shift, but that shift rarely arrives gently. More often, it arrives as emotional overflow, a breaking point where what has been held down begins to surface without control, without filtering, without permission. And right before that point, there is often a strange stillness. Not peace, but suspension. A tension so concentrated it feels like everything has paused internally, as if something within them has stopped pretending it is not there anymore. And in that stillness, something begins to surface that can no longer be pushed back down. Not because they suddenly want to face it, but because the mechanisms they've relied on, distance, distraction, rational explanation, start to lose their effectiveness. They may still try to tell themselves it's temporary. They may still try to reduce it to timing, coincidence, or exaggeration. But emotional reality doesn't dissolve under interpretation. It persists beyond what the mind is willing to admit. And at this point, what they feel has already moved beyond the comfort of denial. Something shifts internally. A quiet recognition begins to form, even if they resist it. This was never just about managing emotion. It was about being confronted by what emotion exposes. And what it exposes is unsettling. Because your presence doesn't only generate attraction, it activates something that has been quietly undernourished inside them. Something connected to recognition, emotional honesty, and a need for connection that was never fully met or acknowledged. That is where the internal structure starts to lose its simplicity. They can no longer reduce the experience to something ordinary or easily categorized. It keeps returning in the form of questions they cannot fully settle. Why you? Why this feels so significant? Why it carries a weight that doesn't match the surface explanation. The mind searches for answers it can control, but what is being triggered does not operate in that layer alone. It is tied to something older, something emotionally stored rather than consciously remembered. The unconscious does not erase, it preserves. And sometimes it brings those preserved fragments back into contact with something in the present that mirrors them. In that sense, you become a reflection, not just of who they are now, but of emotional possibilities they associate with what they once needed, or what they once felt capable of becoming under different conditions. And that creates a subtle form of grief mixed into the attachment. Not only desire, but a sense of loss. A loss tied to an imagined version of themselves, one that felt more open, less defended, more emotionally available. Whether that version ever fully existed or not, it still carries emotional weight as if it did. This is where the internal conflict deepens. Because being near you feels like being pulled toward that possibility, while also being forced to confront the version of themselves built in response to past experience. The defended version, the controlled version, the version designed to avoid emotional exposure rather than risk it. So the system splits again. One part moves toward connection, drawn by meaning, recognition, and emotional intensity. Another part pulls back, not out of indifference, but out of protection. Because closeness now feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like loss of control. And as that tension builds, the mind tries to stabilize the experience by explaining it away. It labels it as temporary, or situational, or something that can be mentally reduced. But this is not true processing. It is containment. A way to lower emotional pressure without resolving what is underneath it. Containment can delay awareness, but it cannot remove the underlying force. Because what is unprocessed does not vanish, it shifts form. It becomes restlessness without clear cause, anxiety without clear origin, a quiet sense that something is missing even when nothing externally is wrong. And over time, your presence becomes linked to that internal signal. Not because you created it, but because their mind has connected you to something unresolved within them, something unfinished that resurfaces whenever they think of you or feel the absence of you. And eventually, a quieter realization begins to form beneath everything else. Their reaction is not only directed at you as a person, it is directed at what you activate within them. And in the end, everything comes back to that internal recognition. What feels so intense was never only about another person. It was about what got awakened within them in your presence. What surfaced from beneath control, logic, and carefully built emotional defenses. And once something like that is awakened, it does not return to silence in the same way it arrived. At first, the mind resists it. It tries to label it, minimize it, explain it, or distance itself from it. But what is emotionally real does not dissolve through explanation. It only changes shape over time. And in that process, clarity and confusion often exist at the same time. And yet, underneath all of it, something remains consistent. A sense that this is not random, that it carries meaning, that it cannot be fully reduced or ignored without leaving something unresolved behind. Over time, what cannot be resolved externally becomes internal pressure. And what is held in pressure does not stay static. It moves, it builds, it transforms the way a person experiences both themselves and the situation. Eventually, every form of suppression reaches its limit. Not in a dramatic instant, but in a quiet realization that what is felt can no longer be fully dismissed. At that point, the only thing left is confrontation, with the emotion, with the meaning it carries, and with the parts of the self it brings into focus. And whether that confrontation leads to clarity, distance, acceptance, or change, one truth remains at the center of it all. What was activated cannot simply be returned to what it was before. It becomes part of the internal landscape, not as confusion to escape, but as something that reshapes understanding from within. And that is where the story truly ends, not with resolution from the outside, but with a shift that happens inside them, quietly, permanently, and beyond full control.